I stood in my late father's study, staring at the empty space beneath his old oak desk. The cedar chest was gone. It had sat in that exact spot for as long as I could remember. For decades of family history stored inside those worn wooden walls. Letters from my mother, notes I had written as a child, important documents about the family construction business that my father had carefully saved over the years. My stepmother, Vivian, stood near the doorway with her arms folded across her chest. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, when she said she had disposed of old clutter. Like 40 years of memories were just garbage to be cleared away. My wife, Paula, stood beside me. She would not look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, and that small thing felt like a warning. Then Vivian added one final line. Your father didn't want you burdened by the past. That sentence made my chest tighten immediately. My father, Harold Mercer, kept everything. Birthday cards from 30 years ago, old receipts, handwritten meeting notes. He always said that history mattered more than most people realized. He would never throw those letters away. Not ever. Something was very wrong. My name is Calvin Mercer. I am 39 years old, originally from Nashville, Tennessee. If you are new to this channel, please subscribe right now, because what I found over the weeks that followed completely changed everything I believed about my own family. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in the guest room of my father's house, listening to the silence, my mind turning over Vivian's words again and again. She had seemed too confident, too relaxed for someone who had just admitted to throwing away 40 years of family history. That kind of calm only came when a person had a plan. Around midnight, I knocked on Paula's door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed, staring at her phone. When she looked up at me, her eyes were red. I asked her what she knew. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me. Vivian had called her 2 weeks before my father's death. She had warned Paula that some of the letters in that cedar chest might cause problems. She had used the word interfere. Specifically, she said the letters might interfere with the will. My stomach dropped straight to the floor. The will had been updated recently. Vivian had mentioned it casually at the funeral, like it was nothing important. But now that word, interfere, sat in my chest like a stone. Those letters had not been sentimental clutter to Vivian. They had been a threat, and she had removed them before anyone could read them. I drove to the bank early the next morning. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly the whole way there. My father and I had shared a safety deposit box for over 10 years. It was something he had set up quietly, without telling anyone else in the family. He always said a man needed a private place to keep important things safe. I had not opened that box in over a year. I did not know what I would find inside. The bank assistant led me to the vault without a word. I sat down at the small table, slid the key into the lock, and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized envelopes. Dozens of them. My hands began to shake. Each envelope contained photographs, printed photographs of letters. The exact same letters that had been in the cedar chest. My father had photographed every single one of them. He had organized each photograph carefully, labeled them, and stored them here where Vivian could never reach them. He had known. He had prepared for this. I flipped through envelope after envelope, my eyes filling with tears. Then, near the back of the box, I found something that was not a photograph. It was a sealed letter, still in its original envelope. The return address was from a law firm. The date on the postmark was 6 months before my father died. My hands were trembling as I carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on legal stationery from a firm called Hartwell and Associates. It was addressed directly to my father. I read it slowly, twice, to make sure I understood every single word. The letter was a response to concerns my father had raised privately with the attorney. In it, he described large withdrawals from a shared business account, money he had not authorized and could not explain. He was clearly worried. The tone of the letter was careful and serious. But it was the final paragraph that stopped me cold. The attorney advised my father to review his life insurance policy immediately. Specifically, he suggested checking the beneficiary designation. I put the letter down and sat very still. My father had a life insurance policy worth $1.2 million. I knew about it because he had mentioned it years ago, saying it was meant to protect the family business if anything ever happened to him. I pulled out my phone and called the insurance company directly. After verifying my identity as next of kin, the representative confirmed something that made the room feel like it was tilting. The sole beneficiary on that policy was Vivian, and the beneficiary change had been made just 2 months before my father's sudden heart attack. I sat in my car outside the bank for a long time before I could make myself drive. My father had died of a heart attack. Everyone had accepted that explanation without question. He was 64 years old. He had been under stress. These things happen to men his age. But now I was not so sure. When I got back to the house, I went through the remaining envelopes more carefully. Near the middle of the stack, I found a photograph of a letter that was different from the others. It was not a business document or a personal note. It was a letter from my father's cardiologist, Dr. Atkins, written about 4 months before his death. The doctor's letter was serious. My father had been experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath. Dr. Atkins had strongly recommended a full round of follow-up tests, a stress test, an echocardiogram, and a specialist consultation. He had described them as urgent. My father never took those tests. I was certain of that now. I remembered visiting him around that time. He had seemed tired, but when I asked about his health, he waved it off. He told me Vivian said it was just stress from work. She had told him the tests were unnecessary. Vivian had medical power of attorney. She had the ability to manage his healthcare decisions directly. I needed air. I stepped outside and walked around the yard, tried to organize everything I was learning into a clear order. The picture forming in my mind was dark, and I did not want to jump ahead of what the evidence actually showed. I needed to be careful. I needed to be smart about this. Back inside, I returned to the envelopes and found a photograph of a business document I had never seen before. It was a clause from an earlier version of the family company's ownership agreement. The document stated clearly that my father intended to transfer majority ownership of Mercer Construction back to me after a formal review period. I had been working the business for over a decade. My father had always said the company would return to my control once the timing was right. But in the current version of the will, the one Vivian had referenced, I held only 30% of the company. Vivian controlled 51%. That was a controlling majority. It gave her full power to make decisions, hire and fire, and even sell the company if she ever chose to do so. The document I was holding now made it clear that the original arrangement had been very different, and the review period my father had written about had ended just 3 days before his heart attack, 3 days before he died. I went back to my hotel that night and spread everything across the bed. I needed to see it all at once, dates, documents, and decisions lined up side by side, so the pattern would become clear. I wrote everything down on a notepad in the order it had happened. First, the life insurance beneficiary was changed to Vivian alone. That happened 8 months before my father's death. Second, the will was updated to give Vivian 51% of company and reduce my share to 30%. That happened 6 months before his death. Third, the cardiologist sent the urgent letter recommending follow-up tests. That happened 4 months before his death. Fourth, Vivian canceled those medical appointments. That happened shortly after the letter was sent. Fifth, the review period for returning majority business ownership to me expired. That happened 3 days before his death. Sixth, my father died suddenly of a heart attack. Seventh, the cedar chest with 40 years of letters disappeared. I stared at that list for a long time. Each event on its own could be explained away easily enough, but all of them together told a story that was impossible to ignore. I was not ready to make accusations. I was not going to rush. Instead, I began making phone calls and requesting certified copies of every document I could legally obtain. The official reading took place 2 weeks after my father's funeral. It was held in a quiet conference room at a downtown law office. The attorney, a man named Mr. Pearson, sat at the head of the table looking uncomfortable. Vivian sat across from me, perfectly dressed, her posture relaxed and confident. Paula sat beside me. Her hand rested in her lap. She did not reach for mine. Mr. Pearson read through the will slowly. When he reached the section about Mercer Construction, Vivian's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. 51% to Vivian, 30% to Calvin. The rest split between minor accounts and charitable donations. After the reading, Vivian leaned toward me with a warm expression that did not reach her eyes. She said she hoped we could work together smoothly. She offered me a consulting role in the company my father had built from absolutely nothing. I smiled politely and thanked her. Inside, I was completely still and focused, because I already knew that the documents Mr. Pearson had just read out loud did not match what my father had written and recorded months earlier. The photographs in that safety deposit box told a very different story. I was not crushed. I was not finished. I walked out of that office with my certified copies tucked safely in my briefcase and began preparing for what came next. 2 days after the will reading, I called Mr. Pearson's office and asked for a private meeting. His assistant hesitated, but eventually gave me a slot the following afternoon. I arrived early, sat in the waiting room, and went over my notes one last time. When I walked into his office, I placed one of the photograph letters on his desk without saying a word. It was a document showing my father's original intentions for the business ownership transfer. Mr. Pearson picked it up carefully, read it, and set it back down. The color drained from his face completely. He was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he admitted something he clearly did not want to say. My father had requested an addendum to the will, a formal update that would have reflected his original ownership intentions. Mr. Pearson had prepared the paperwork and sent it to my father for review, but the addendum had never been finalized. My father had died before signing it. I asked Mr. Pearson one careful question. Had my father ever sent written instructions canceling the addendum? Had he ever formally withdrawn that request? Mr. Pearson looked at his hands. Then he shook his head slowly. No, he had received no written cancellation. The addendum had simply been left unsigned, which meant the will being used might not reflect my father's last legal intentions at all. I did not go to the police. Not yet. I did not confront Vivian. I did not make a single public accusation. Instead, I made my next move carefully and quietly. As a 30% shareholder in Mercer Construction, I had certain legal rights that Vivian could not take away from me. One of those rights was the ability to request a formal financial audit of the company. It was a clean, lawful, and completely reasonable action for any minority shareholder to take. I submitted the request in writing through a business attorney I hired specifically for this purpose. His name was Mr. Galloway, and he was well known for handling complex inheritance and business cases. Vivian received the audit request and called me the same afternoon. Her tone was sharp and dismissive. She called the request paranoid and completely unnecessary. She told me the company's finances were perfectly managed and that I was simply wasting everyone's time. I thanked her calmly and said I was sure the audit would confirm that. The audit team arrived at Mercer Construction's offices 2 weeks later. They spent 4 full days going through records. On the 5th day, the lead auditor contacted Mr. Galloway with an initial finding. Irregular expense reimbursements had been identified, large amounts, approved personally by Vivian, with no supporting documentation attached to any of them. While the audit was still underway, I turned my attention to the life insurance policy. My father had maintained that policy for over 15 years. For most of that time, the beneficiary had been split between me and a charitable fund he supported. Changing it entirely to Vivian, just 2 months before his death, felt deeply out of character for the man I knew. I contacted the insurance company and requested formal documentation of the beneficiary change. As next of kin, I had the right to review the paperwork. After some back and forth, the company sent over a signed authorization form. I looked at it carefully for a long time. Something was not right. I had grown up watching my father sign documents. His handwriting was distinctive, neat, slightly forward-leaning, and consistent year after year. The signature on this form was close to his, but it was not quite right. The pen pressure was different. The loop on the final letter was slightly too large. Someone who had not studied his handwriting closely would likely never notice. But I noticed immediately. I forwarded the document to Mr. Galloway with my concerns written out clearly. He reviewed it and agreed it was worth pursuing. He contacted the insurance company on my behalf and outlined what I had observed. They opened a routine verification review within the week. That same evening, I drove past my father's house. Through the front window, I could see Vivian at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. For the first time since this all began, she looked rattled. Paula and I had barely spoken in weeks. The distance between us had been growing quietly ever since the night she admitted what Vivian had told her. I wanted to understand her, but I was also deeply hurt. She had known something was wrong, and she had said nothing. One evening, she asked if we could talk. We sat at the small table in the hotel room, and she told me she felt like I was attacking a grieving widow, that I was tearing the family apart over documents and suspicions. She asked me to step back and let things settle. I did not argue. I opened my briefcase and placed the photographs on the table one by one. The cardiologist's letter, the insurance form, the business clause, the timeline I had written out in my own hand. I let her read everything. When she finished, she was very quiet. She did not apologize right away. But something shifted in her expression. She was starting to see it clearly now. Then she told me something she had been holding back. A few months earlier, Vivian had called her separately, not just to warn her about the letters, but to encourage her, convince me to sell my shares in Mercer Construction. Vivian had offered Paula a private payment if she could persuade me. Paula had said no, but she had never told me about the call. The trust between us cracked a little further that night. About 3 weeks into the audit process, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Pete Walton. He had worked as a foreman at Mercer Construction for over 20 years. He had known my father since the very early days of the business. He asked if we could meet somewhere private. We chose a diner about 30 minutes outside of town. I arrived first and sat in a corner booth near the window. Pete was a big, quiet man with calloused hands and steady eyes. He sat across from me and folded his hands on the table like a man preparing to say something that had been weighing on him for a long time. He told me my father had been planning to restructure the leadership of the company, not because the business was failing, but because my father had grown deeply uncomfortable with Vivian's increasing involvement in decisions that were not hers to make. He had expressed this to Pete privately, more than once, in the months before his death. Pete also told me that in the week before my father died, he had overheard a serious argument inside the main office building. My father's voice had been raised, which was completely unusual. He was a calm man by nature. The argument had been about money, specifically about large amounts being moved without proper authorization. Pete had not known what to do with that information until now. The conversation with Pete gave me a new direction to follow. He mentioned that the final will have been signed and notarized at my father's regular bank branch downtown. That detail stayed with me all the way home. I contacted Mr. Galloway and asked whether bank security footage from notarizations was ever preserved. He looked into it and came back to me 2 days later with unexpected news. The branch kept footage of all notarizations as part of their standard record-keeping protocol. The footage from the day my father signed the final version of his will was still available. It took a formal written request and several days of patient waiting. But eventually, I sat in a small bank conference room and watched the footage on a laptop screen. I had expected to see my father the way I remembered him, steady, alert, and completely in control of himself. He was not like that in the footage. He appeared unwell. His movements were slow and uncertain. At one point, he seemed to lose track of what was being discussed and had to be gently redirected by the notary. His eyes were slightly unfocused. He looked like a man who was not fully present in the room. The footage was not proof of wrongdoing on its own, but it raised a deeply serious question about whether my father had truly understood what he was signing that day. Mr. Galloway reviewed the footage that same morning. He looked at me quietly and said we needed to move quickly. With Mr. Galloway's guidance, I submitted a formal request of my father's complete medical records. As his son and the adult next of kin, I had the legal right to access them. The hospital released the full records within 10 business days. I sat at the hotel desk and went through every page carefully. The picture was worse than I had expected. Dr. Atkins had flagged my father's condition as urgent on 3 separate occasions over the final 5 months of his life. Each time, he had recommended immediate follow-up testing. Each time, the appointments had either been canceled outright or simply never scheduled at all. The record showed clearly who had made those cancellations. Vivian held medical power of attorney that gave her the legal authority to manage my father's healthcare decisions on his behalf. She had used that authority to cancel the most critical appointments his doctor had ever requested. There was one note in the records that stood out from all the rest. Dr. Adkins had written, in plain language, that failure to complete the recommended tests created significant risk of a serious cardiac event. He had described it as a preventable risk. My father never completed those tests. He died of a cardiac event 4 weeks after that note was written. Vivian had the authority and the legal responsibility to make sure he received proper care. She had chosen not to use it. Mr. Galloway read through the records that same evening and made a single phone call. Then he told me it was time to file. Filing the petition was one of the hardest things I had ever done, not because I was uncertain. By this point, I was more certain than ever, but because once I filed, there was no going back. I was formally challenging my father's will in a court of law. I was putting everything on public record. Mr. Galloway filed a petition on a Tuesday morning. It cited documented concerns about undue influence, the mental and physical condition of my father at the time of signing, procedural irregularities in the will's final amendment, and the unexplained absence of a formally requested addendum. Every claim was backed by evidence. The filing was clean, lawful, and carefully constructed from the ground up. Vivian received official notification by the end of that same day. Her response came quickly. Within 48 hours, she filed a motion through her own attorney attempting to freeze my access to the company's financial accounts. She claimed I was acting against the estate's best interests. Mr. Galloway challenged the freeze motion immediately. The judge reviewing the case declined to approve it, noting that I was acting fully within my rights as both a shareholder and a named beneficiary of the estate. But the attempt told me something very important. Vivian was not acting like someone who had nothing to hide. She was acting like someone trying desperately to cut off my resources before I could gather any more. She was afraid of what I already had. 2 weeks after the petition was filed, the full audit report landed on Mr. Galloway's desk. It was 43 pages long. I read every single one of them twice. The findings were significant. Over an 18-month period, Vivian had approved expense reimbursements totaling over $200,000 from Mercer Construction's operating accounts. The payments had been routed through a vendor account that, upon closer inspection, appeared to have no active business address and no registered employees. It was, in practical terms, a shell account. The audit team could not confirm that any legitimate business services had ever been received in exchange for the payments. When the report was shared with the company's board of directors, the reaction was immediate. 2 of the 4 board members, both long-serving executives who worked closely alongside my father for years, formally requested a meeting without Vivian present. They had serious questions that the expense trail simply could not answer. Vivian found out about the meeting the same day. She called it a coup. She accused me of manipulating the board and tried to steal the company from her. She sent a letter through her attorney claiming that I had acted improperly throughout the entire audit process. Mr. Galloway responded calmly in writing. He pointed out that the audit had been requested lawfully, conducted entirely independently, and that every finding had been produced by a third-party firm with no connection to me whatsoever. Numbers did not lie, and these numbers were very loud. The insurance company's verification review had been running quietly in the background for several weeks. I had almost forgotten about it in the middle of everything else pressing in on me at once. Then one morning, Mr. Galloway called with important news. The insurance company had brought in a forensic handwriting expert to analyze the signature on the beneficiary change form. The analysis was not yet complete, but the review had already escalated from a routine check to a full formal investigation. The $1.2 million payout had been paused indefinitely while the process continued. Vivian's attorney sent a letter the same afternoon demanding that the insurance company release the funds immediately and accusing them of acting in bad faith toward their client. The letter was aggressive and filled with legal threats. It demanded a formal response within 5 business days. The insurance company replied that it was legally obligated to complete its due diligence before releasing any funds under any circumstances. The investigation would continue regardless. That evening, Mr. Galloway mentioned something that stopped me mid-sentence. He had tried to reach Vivian's attorney to discuss a scheduling matter related to the probate petition. The attorney's office told him she was unavailable. He tried the next morning. Unavailable again. He tried Vivian's personal number as a simple courtesy. She did not answer. She did not call back. For a woman who had spent months being loud, aggressive, and completely in control, the silence felt very significant. Paula came to my hotel room one evening, without calling ahead. I opened the door and she was standing in the hallway with her coat still on, her eyes swollen from crying. I stepped back and let her inside. She sat on the edge of the chair by the window and told me she was sorry. Not the kind of apology that was quick and easy and want to move on fast. She meant every single word of it. She told me she had been scared. She had grown up with very little. And the thought of losing financial stability she had worked so hard to build terrified her deeply. Vivian had known exactly how to find and use that fear against her. She told me she understood now what my father had truly been facing in those final months. She had reread every document I had shown her weeks earlier, this time without the fear clouding her ability to think clearly. Then she said something that changed the weight of everything I was carrying. She told me she was willing to testify. About the phone call from Vivian. About the pressure to convince me to sell my shares. About the private payment that had been offered to her and which she had refused. She said she would go on record with all of it if Mr. Galloway believed it would strengthen the case. I sat across from her for a long moment without speaking. Then I reached over and took her hand. For the first time in months, I did not feel like I was carrying all of this completely alone. The probate court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early spring. The courtroom was small and quietly serious. I sat beside Mr. Galloway, my folder of organized evidence on the table in front of me. Vivian sat across the room with her attorney, dressed carefully, her expression controlled and composed. But that control began to slip as the hearing progressed. Mr. Galloway presented the evidence methodically and without drama. The timeline of the will changes and insurance modifications, the cardiologist's letters and the canceled appointments, the bank footage showing my father's confused and unwell state on the day of signing, the audit findings with the unexplained expense trail, the attorney's admission that the addendum had never been formally canceled, Paula's written statement about the pressure she had received directly from Vivian. The judge listened without interrupting. She asked a small number of precise and pointed questions. Vivian's attorney objected several times, but the judge overruled most of them without hesitation. When it was Vivian's turn to present her defense through her attorney, the arguments felt thin and unconvincing. They relied on character statements and flat denials. There was very little substance to counter the documented evidence on our side. By mid-afternoon, the judge had heard enough. She announced a temporary suspension of Vivian's controlling authority over Mercer Construction, pending further full review of the estate proceedings. The courtroom went very quiet. Vivian gripped the edge of the table. Her attorney placed a hand carefully on her arm. 3 weeks after the hearing, the forensic handwriting report arrived. It was 6 pages long, technical in its language, and very precise in its conclusions. The expert had analyzed the signature on the insurance beneficiary change form against 17 confirmed samples of my father's handwriting drawn from business contracts, personal letters, and bank documents spanning 10 years of his life. The conclusion was written in careful, measured language. The expert had found strong probability of guided alteration in the signature on the beneficiary form. The term meant that someone had very likely guided my father's hand while he signed, or had altered the signature after fact. The report stopped short of making a criminal accusation. That was not the expert's professional role. But the findings were more than damaging enough on their own. The insurance company received the report and issued a formal notice within 48 hours. The $1.2 million payout would not be released. The policy would remain fully frozen pending a complete investigation by the company's legal and compliance team. I sat in Mr. Galloway's office when the confirmation came through. He placed a report on his desk carefully and looked at me over his glasses without speaking for a moment. Vivian's financial foundation was beginning to collapse on every side. The company funds she had expected control were under audit review. The insurance payout she had clearly counted on was frozen solid. Her authority over Mercer Construction had already been suspended by the court. Everything she had carefully built was coming apart at the seams. I thought I had seen everything inside that safety deposit box. I had gone through every single envelope carefully in those first days after the funeral. But 2 months into court process, when I returned to make fresh copies of specific documents for Mr. Galloway, I found something I had missed entirely on my first visit. At the very bottom of the box, tucked completely beneath the last row of envelopes, was a single sealed letter. The envelope was thick, the formal kind used for important correspondence. On the front, written in my father's careful handwriting, were just 4 words. If she interferes, open. My hands went completely still. I sat down at the bank table and opened it slowly and carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, written in my father's neat and purposeful handwriting. He described Vivian's growing pressure on him over many months to consolidate assets into accounts she controlled alone. He described conversations in which she had pushed him repeatedly to remove my name from business documents and to reduce my ownership share. He wrote about his growing discomfort, his doubts, and his decision to begin protecting his records in secret. He then stated plainly and directly that his true intention, unchanged from the original agreement, was for me to regain full majority control of Mercer Construction. The letter was dated 17 days after the alleged final version of his will have been signed. It was the clearest statement of his real wishes that existed anywhere. Mr. Galloway submitted the sealed letter to the court the following week. It was accompanied by a handwriting verification from the same forensic expert who had analyzed the insurance documents. The letter was confirmed as fully authentic, written entirely in my father's own hand, with no signs of alteration anywhere. Vivian's attorney responded with a long and aggressive legal filing that attempted to question the letter's context and relevance to the case. The arguments were creative, but they were clearly built on desperation rather than substance. For days after the letter was submitted, I received a phone call from Vivian's attorney. He asked carefully whether I would be open to a private settlement discussion. I told Mr. Galloway, who advised me to listen to whatever was being offered before making any final decisions. The offer arrived in writing the following morning. Vivian would voluntarily relinquish her controlling majority share of Mercer Construction and return to the ownership structure that reflected my father's original stated intentions. In exchange, she wanted me to formally withdraw all remaining legal filings and agree not to pursue any further review of the estate. I read the offer twice. Then I set it down on the desk. Mr. Galloway asked me quietly what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted full legal correction through the court, not a quiet agreement behind closed doors, not a private handshake that could later be disputed or reversed. Everything needed to go on the public record properly, exactly the way my father would have wanted it handled. I declined the settlement. The final court session was scheduled for a Wednesday morning 6 weeks later. By this point, the evidence had been so completely and carefully documented that the hearing itself was shorter than I had expected. Mr. Galloway presented the full case in organized sections: the will irregularities, the notarization footage, the medical records, the audit findings, the sealed letter, and both forensic reports. The judge had clearly reviewed everything in advance with great care. She asked focused and precise questions, took careful notes, and gave both sides equal time for final statements. Vivian's attorney argued that the settlement offer had been a reasonable and fair resolution, and that continuing the case served no real purpose. He suggested the entire matter had been driven by personal family conflict rather than genuine legal substance. The judge did not appear persuaded by any of it. She delivered her ruling that same afternoon. The contested amendment to my father's will was formally invalidated. The court found sufficient evidence of undue influence and procedural irregularities to overturn the changes made in the final months of his life. The prior version of the will, the one granting me majority ownership of Mercer Construction, was restored and declared the only controlling document going forward. Vivian lost her controlling share of the company immediately and completely. The life insurance payout remained frozen under separate ongoing investigation, and the court noted the forensic review officially in its record. I walked out of that courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight. Mr. Galloway shook my hand firmly on the steps. My father's company was coming home. Several months passed. The business stabilized. The board members who had bravely questioned Vivian's leadership remained in place, and together we began the slow and steady work of restoring what had been quietly taken apart. Pete Walton received promotion my father had been planning to give him long before his death. The insurance investigation was still ongoing. I had made peace with that uncertainty. My job had never been to destroy Vivian personally. It had always been to protect what my father built and to restore exactly what he intended. Then one afternoon, as I was working late in the corner office, I heard a soft knock at the open door. I looked up, and Vivian was standing in the doorway. She looked smaller than I remembered. The cold confidence and sharp authority that had always surrounded her were completely gone. She looked hollow and deeply tired, like someone who had finally run out of moves and knew it. She asked quietly if I would help her get back on her feet. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then I told her clearly and without any trace of anger that I would make certain she received exactly what she was legally entitled to under the estate's lawful distribution. Nothing more, nothing vindictive, nothing beyond what the law had already decided was fair. She nodded once and walked away without another word. That evening, I carried the cedar chest up from storage and placed it carefully beneath the desk in my father's study. My study now. I put every photograph letter back inside in the exact order he had arranged them. Vivian had tried to erase my father's history. Instead, she had exposed herself completely, and I had not needed to break a single law to win.